Good evening. I love it when I'm in the South. People say good evening. You know, up north you say good evening and people go, terrible. I don't know, it's hard to get used to. Thank you for coming. Thanks to Aaron Dorwich for inviting me, Trinity University for hosting the presentation, and the Lennox Foundation for its generous funding. I look forward to a lively and perhaps challenging question and answer session. Start my timer so I don't just blab on. For those who Googled me, I'm neither a Stalinist nor a CIA agent. Not everything you see on the web is true. I do have a conservative family background, and as a 14-year-old, I passed out flyers for Barry Goldwater, a person who I thought had great integrity. Although I've moved to the left, I still think Barry Goldwater had tremendous integrity, and I think those things matter. So I'm sort of more towards the Sanders campaign, but I'm going to wear different hats. As a journalist, I mourn the current state of major corporate media, which just scares me. And there's a recent book on the post-fact society that gave me nightmares. My title tonight was cooked up a long time ago when many of us didn't think that the current presidential campaign would be Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. Seriously? Or just, okay. So I wear many hats, one of which is progressive left political activist. That's obvious. I'm an investigative journalist. A bunch of years ago, I was abducted by sociologists who said, you've been studying the right wing for so long, and you seem to know like there are differences. And that seemed smart to me. So I want to talk about the fact that when I talk about right-wing populism, I'm not talking about neo-Nazis. Although some may use right-wing populist rhetoric, I'm not talking about the Klan. And I want to really point out that the political system is not like the wonderful center and the extreme nutcases, because it's just not true. Either in political science or sociology, people are going to say that's kind of a silly way of looking at the world. So when I talk about right-wing populism, I'm talking about people who have become unhappy with the conservative right and the Republican Party. That makes sense. And really, you know, this is the populist sector. This is the center, but the center shifts. I mean, if you talk about the political center as always being great, I would remind you that in some societies, the political center was made up of people who were supporting the genocide of some other. So the center is not always correct, and the right is not always the center. And if I'm talking about right-wing populism, I'm explicitly not talking about neo-Nazis and the Klan, although I have studied them. I'm wearing my hat tonight as someone who worries about democracy and human rights. So what's democracy? I'm going to define it as a process, not a specific set of institutions. Democracy is a process that assumes that the majority of people over time, given enough accurate information and the ability to participate in a free and open debate, and can vote without intimidation, reach constructive decisions that benefit the whole of society, preserve liberty, protect our freedoms, extend equality, and defend democracy itself. To me, that's what democracy is. So I know I'm going to upset some of you when I say I believe that Donald Trump threatens democracy, not only because he's using right-wing populist kinds of rhetoric, which doesn't necessarily lead to the kinds of bigotry that he's involved in, but it often does. And he has a conspiratorial view of power. You know, there's always some conspiracy behind everything. He has targeted a bunch of groups of people he doesn't dislike, like Muslims, Mexicans, strong women. He's scapegoating them to gain political power. And this is a kind of rhetoric that's built around the frame of an upcoming battle against subversive conspiracies by evildoers, in which the good people battle evil people and thus restore America's past glory and make America great again. This is not problematic in wanting America to be great. We are Americans. We want our society and our nation to be, you know, something we can get behind. Now to my allies on the left. There is no, I repeat, there is no social science data that shows that people who join conservative or right-wing movements are any more stupid or crazy than the rest of us. That may be a sad commentary on American society, but there is no social science evidence that these people are stupid and crazy. And when you call conservatives and right-wingers stupid or crazy, you are a bigot. Okay? So what else is going on? Well, they have a view of the world based on ideology, frames, and narratives, which you disagree with. And you might say, doesn't make any sense. They think the people on the left have an ideology instead of frames and narratives that don't make any sense. So how does a conspiratory storyline work in right-wing ideological populism? Well, it paints a picture of betrayal and subversion of the American dream by parasites picking the pockets of the deserving, productive citizens. These are parasites who are often portrayed as people of color or immigrants. And it's linked to a claim that treacherous plotters above in government and elites, secret elites up above, are plotting with these parasites below. So it's a double-edged kind of sword. This is what I scare people with. Don't worry, it's just to scare you. That's my big chart. So we're back to this. So in the right-wing populist movement, we basically have these rhetorical things about the producers against the parasites. Now, the parasites up above are, basically these elites who are secretly planning the destruction of the middle class. And down below, it's basically lazy, sinful, and subversive parasites. Now, who are the corrupt elite parasites up above historically? Well, you know them all. The Jews, the bankers, the Illuminati, the godless secular humanists, Council on Foreign Relations, apparently now transgender people. I don't get it either. And the whole storyline here is that that's how the world works. The government really isn't your government. It's a government of secret elites. Okay, so that's a problem. And so down below, now, of course, people are mad at the secret elites up above who don't really exist. There are elites up above. They're hardly secret. You see them all the time. And they don't have secret meetings where they plot things you don't know about, because these meetings all come out as policy, and there are fights among the elites, so they aren't always on the same page. Let's move on to the lazy, sinful, and subversive parasites, my favorite. We know who they are: the undeserving poor, black people, welfare mothers, non-white immigrants, the sinful, feminists, abortions, homosexuals, and their supporters, non-Christians, and the subversives, which are currently, and this changes over time, because, in the 1920s, Russians and Italians were the subversives. Hello. Immigrants, social and economic justice activists, Muslims, labor and community organizers, and so we're back to this. Don't worry, I'm just scaring you. So, we'll go back to that. So Mitt Romney talks about the makers and the takers, and that 40% of the American population are people who are dependent, this is his quote, dependent on government, who believe they are victims, who believe the government has a responsibility to care for them, who believe they are entitled to health care, to food, to housing. Excuse me, this is Europe. The idea that the government is established to provide not just domestic tranquility and the safety of the state, but the pursuit of happiness. Isn't it in a document I remember? I don't know. Maybe I'm just pre-associating. So that, in fact, a lot of people moving on from the idea that the church would take care of all the poor came to an understanding that perhaps this had a larger social meaning, and that perhaps the government would really be concerned about whether people were starving or stuff like that. Now, there's a whole bunch of good information about how this plays out. Williams traces this to a 1960s idea of an organized right-wing campaign to portray the undeserving poor, who were basically black women driving Cadillacs and eating caviar on their food stamps. So Lowe found similar subtext in the right-wing tax revolt in California of the 1970s. Hardesty, who was my boss, Gene Hardesty at Political Research Associates, writes about the cynical use of racialized caricatures of the undeserving poor and the mobilization of resentment among white voters and white constituencies. The outcome has had devastating results for poor families and welfare recipients, according to Morgan, Acker, and Waite. So Okay, so is it all us against them? Does it have to be this idea that there's the makers, the takers, the producers, and the parasites, that there are people who deserve to be citizens and people who don't deserve to be citizens, and the way you tell that is the color of their skin or who they'd like to sleep with? Shh, I say nothing. So here's the thing, and this is about the us versus them. They always lie to us. It doesn't matter who they are. Because one of the hallmarks of bigotry is that their religion, ideology, or culture is promoting lying. They can't be trusted. They're probably conspiring against us right now. They threaten our entire way of life. They're not like us. They don't really treat their children the same way we do. They don't value human life at all. Sound familiar? Okay, so what do we do? Well, we must act now before it's too late. Attack first. Our war is justified. God is on our side. That's the universal narrative of justified aggression against another. They're bad, we're good. Why wait? They're coming after us. Let's get them now. Now, conspiracy theory is attached to this, and these are apocalyptic timetables. Okay, so what's an apocalyptic timetable? Try saying apocalyptic millennialism 3 times fast. Apocalyptic timetables say basically the apocalypse. The words prophecy, apocalypse, and revelation come from the same root words in ancient languages. It means that there's an upcoming confrontation between good and evil, during which hidden truths will be unveiled, revealed, revelation, and the outcome is uncertain. But whatever it is, the world will be changed dramatically after it. That is the basic apocalyptic narrative. It's certainly central to the religion I was brought up in and still practice, which is Christianity. There is a reference to it in Judaism. Obviously, there's references to it in Islam. A lot of ISIS is involved in apocalyptic prophecy about the retaking of the Temple Mount, which they call Haram al-Sharif, which is in the hands of Jews, but is an Islamic shrine. And they're apocalyptic, and they believe in a prophecy that's very disputed in Islam about the black flags of Khorasan, which the young Muslim men will sweep down from the north and retake Jerusalem and reinstore the caliphate. It's not because they're dumb or crazy, or they have a vision of their future in which demands that they seize Jerusalem and establish Muslim world, a Muslim world. Less than 1% of Muslims around the world believe this is anything but heresy, just so you know. So what's my thesis? Well, political and religious leaders can become demagogues who use their status to claim that a group of outsiders or others are conspiring to harm the real deserving people. These named others are scapegoated and resisted by us heroic people who are defending our existence and seeking to restore our past glory and make America great again. And this set of dynamics is behind every genocide in history. It's a narrative storyline of all forms of totalitarianism across the political and religious spectrums, and includes Stalinism and Hitlerism, both of which I don't like, according to my worldview, although this is disputed by people like David Horowitz and other folks on the web. So social science would argue that social movements are built around some grievance, some claim that mobilizes people to join. They get recruited, they become members of a movement, and they try and solve their grievances. So one of the core claims right now of white nationalism, essentially, is the embrace of a storyline that straight white Christian men have been dispossessed from their proper place in the nation. And several questions immediately arise. Who are the agents of dispossession? From whom is America to be taken back? To whom is it to be restored? Round up the usual suspects. Now, white nationalism is what the country was founded on. It's embarrassing for me to say that, but it's certainly true. White nationalism was the idea that white people from essentially Northern Europe, English and Germans primarily, but others, were coming to this unoccupied land, because the savages really didn't have a soul, and God's destiny was at hand. Now, For those who don't know what the Puritans and the Pilgrims believed, they believed that America was the New Jerusalem, and that the prophecy of Christ's return depended on them restoring godliness to this new land, the New Jerusalem, and that crossing the water was, in fact, the sign that the apocalypse, the millennial apocalypse, and Jesus' return were at hand. Not only was this the Pilgrims and a lot of the early right-wing Christians who left England because they couldn't get along with anybody, came here and pretty much set up a situation where if you didn't agree with their particular ultra-Calvinist view of the world, you could leave, or if you came back, you'd be killed. And so you have the same situation with the witches in Salem, who mostly were women who didn't fit in. And so there's a kind of a through line of this particular brand of Christianity. Now, there's lots of other brands of Christianity that aren't quite this into death. And I'm from that kind of liberation theology kind of, didn't he talk about love? Anyway, so that's my personal religious and political take on it. When Dylan Roof pulled a gun at the Bible study in Charleston in June of 2015, he shot people reading the Bible and having a Bible study and prayer at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, which in the early 1800s was the center of black resistance in Charleston. Now, we need to jump back a little. But first, I'm going to tell you what he said and why that relates to Charleston and what was called Mother Emanuel Church. Roof told the black participants in the Bible study, "I have to do it. You rape our women, and you're taking over our country, and you have to go." And then he began shooting them at point-blank range, leaving 9 dead. Now, Gerald Horne is a scholar at the University of Houston, and he points out this idea that those people are coming here to rape us, which you've heard before in the current campaign, tracks back to a revolution of the slaves in Haiti and the mass exodus of the remaining slaveholders to ports along the East Coast, including Charleston. And the basic narrative then was that, savage, animalistic black people hacked all the white people to death, which begs the question of how they fled and arrived at the ports. And so that this was a genocide against white people. And the idea that killing white people and raping their women, let's not even have another discussion about that, that this was, in fact, the trope of why black people were both scary and murderous and unable to hold the reins of democratic society. That's a problem right there. So that's basically this idea then that people of color, especially black people, but now also Mexicans, come here and they rape our women, quote unquote, and they poison our democratic civil society. And this has stuck around for a long time. So I'm going to jump into then, how does right-wing populism, which is often racialized, turn into these kinds of movements? And I'm going to give you basically a laundry list, which is, forget that. I'm going to point out that the current theory of what fascism is that it's the most virulent and dangerous form of right-wing populism, and that it's a right-wing populist rhetoric almost never becomes fascistic, and fascism almost never takes state power. That's the good news. The bad news is fascism is the most virulent form of right-wing populism, according to people like Roger Griffin and other experts on fascism. And the dilemma here that we're facing now is it really doesn't matter whether Trump believes what he says. I think he believes what he says when he says it. I don't think he's stupid or crazy. I think he doesn't understand that when you vilify a particular group of people as a major figure in politics or religion, what you're doing is setting up a dynamic where people ask themselves, well, if they're so bad and they're out to destroy our country, why don't we get them first? Historically, this has happened repeatedly. The vilification by a demagogue leads first to verbal attacks, then physical attacks, and then murder. Perhaps I'm exaggerating the possibility here, but people who study these things say, well, bad things can go that far. So vilification leads to something that's called scripted violence, which simply means, and this comes out of the work of Hannah Arendt, but also people who study media, mass media, talked about constitutive rhetoric, that you come up with a rhetoric that leads people to make certain decisions about their actions, and it builds a constituency. So this kind of vilification in the public sphere builds a constituency for action against the scapegoats. And this action can start out by verbal denunciations and lead to terrible things. So let's do the laundry list. This is basically the tools of fear. And you can see it, I don't have to repeat it, but I'm going to say the vilification and demonization of the scapegoated other, combined with authoritarian demagoguery and xenophobia and anti-immigrant rhetoric, the dividing of the nation into producers and parasites, conspiracy theories claiming a subversive threat, apocalyptic warnings that time is running out, the standard aggressive, misogynist, heterosexist, male egocentrism, and a gender panic currently focused on the trans community and bathrooms. Get it? Well, it's a major issue for me. Process the outcome, mobilizing resentment for political gain, undermining democracy itself. The thing about scripted violence is that there's no direct legal connection between the demagogue and the person who is the perpetrator. It's very, very cute, actually, because the demagogue can set out a whole group of claims by which, the other is basically has a target painted on their back. And when someone goes out and attacks them, he or she can say, oh, I had no idea this awful things would happen. So that's scripted violence. It's a ruse. They know full well that that possibility is there. Somewhere in the back of their little ethical mind, there's somebody going, Freud would say, don't do it, don't do it, that's bad, that's bad. And the other side is saying, you want to be president, do it. So you got a problem there, huh? In her small yet powerful book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, Arendt concluded that evil was banal and there was only one clear universal truth. It is that ordinary people have a moral obligation to not look away from individual or institutional acts of cruelty or oppression. And we recognize that this process is at play now. So I did a study back in 2014 before this political campaign started. It was published, I actually wrote it in 2013, called Heroes Know Which Villains to Kill, How Coded Rhetoric Incites Scripted Violence, because I got so tired of having editors tell me, oh, this idea that words can lead to action is just a liberal myth. Well, it's a liberal myth adopted by most social scientists in the world, but facts, they're so malleable, right? So I'm going to cite to one particular awful study by Frohart and Temin, which looked at the manipulation for political ends of language intended to, and this is their quote, intended to create a sense among the population that conflict is inevitable. In Rwanda, prior to the genocide, a private radio station tried to instill fear of an imminent attack on Hutus by Tutsis. In the months before the conflicts in Serbia, the state television attempted to create the impression that a World War II-style ethnic cleansing and genocide was being initiated against the Serbs. What was the result? The Serbs launched a genocidal attack on their neighbors, many of whom they had lived with for generations. They actually worked at Political Research Associates with a refugee who was in a Muslim and Orthodox mixed marriage, and everyone hated them, and they had to flee. They almost starved to death trying to get out of that area. So, and in Georgia, in Russia, basically, throughout the 1990s, Georgian media outlets sought to portray ethnic minorities as threats to Georgia's hard-fought independence, and then the Russians began to argue that all of these ethnic groups surrounding Mother Russia were out to get them. And so you have absolutely terrible mess of all these conflicting claims being made through mass media about who was about to get who. Ooh, I'm on target for time. That's a rarity for me. So you have this happen over and over again. Now, don't blame the media. It's the people who put the content in the media, because even before there was the printing press, There were pogroms, there were genocides, there were people killed, but they tended to be in villages or towns or in certain areas, which would be about how far a horse could travel in 2 or 3 days. That was the range of what you could, who you could inflict harm on. With the advent of the printing press, people could write things about, oh, say, the Jews, who were coming to get you and were agents of Satan and kidnapped children and cut them up and made matzah, which I don't, you know, please don't even go there. But you still hear this around the world in allegations that are anti-Semitic. My favorite theory, which was, you know, centuries ago, and I have a friend who's a scholar who swears this is true, he's written on it. There were the secret Amazons living in the Alps in Switzerland. Yes? No? Really? This was a widespread belief for a very short period of time in Europe, and that they were going to come sweeping down with their swords and bows and arrows and emasculate all the men and kill all the children, and God knows what they were going to do with the women. But, you know, basically it was, you know, it wasn't true, just to be clear. It was not true. But there you go. There's no accounting for conspiracy theories. Now, fascism is a form of totalitarianism, and as I mentioned before, that can appear on the left and right with Hitlerism and Stalinism. There's all sorts of aspects to this: political repression, intrusion into private life, manipulative propaganda, based originally on the work of Bernays, who I am so old I actually interviewed Edward Bernays. I know, isn't that amazing? I mean, he's dead, I'm still alive. You know, it's the way it works out. Fascism. Okay, so I'm going to quote a colleague and friend of mine, Roger Griffin. I will read this because I think this is really good stuff. Fascism is best defined as a revolutionary form of nationalism, one that sets out to be a political, social, and ethical revolution, welding the people into a dynamic national community under a new elite infused with heroic values. The core myth that inspires this project is that only a populist, trans-class movement of purifying, cathartic national rebirth, which has the strange name palingenesis, but all it means is a cathartic national rebirth, can stem the tide of decadence. So that's kind of like a description of all of these things about apocalypticism and conspiracy theories and heroic rebirth and making the ideal people heroic again. I have a whole bunch of stuff here about the nature of fascism in Europe. People forget that there were a number of different forms of fascism in Europe. There was originally Italian fascism. And by the way, the quote attributed to Mussolini that fascism is corporations, you know, might as well, it's a hoax. Supposedly it came out of the Encyclopedia Italiana from somewhere in the 1930s. I went to a library, I photocopied it, I took it to a neighbor who was a native Italian. I sat there while she read it, and we both said, there's no mention of that. It's simply not in there. So all of the 10,000 cites to it as being in the Encyclopedia Italiana. It's not true. What's more, in Italian, corporatism doesn't mean corporation. It means a syndicalist arrangement of workers and managers and other people that was proposed by, wait for it, the Vatican, to try and resolve tensions among the emerging social and economic classes. So the whole idea that fascism has anything to do with corporations per se is baloney. Fascism, however, parasitizes lots of ideologies, and it emerged in Italy as Italian fascism. It was picked up by Hitler in his, don't read Mein Kampf, it's online if you must read it, but it's really pretty bad. Most of the stuff on propaganda is really good, but he plagiarized it from Bernays and others, you know, just one of those things. So it's basically, it's like these appeals. This idea is built around the idea that it's us versus them. So in Italy, it's heroic. In Germany, it's heroic, but it's very, very much more racist, although in Italy, their racism towards the Ethiopian people was tremendous. So that gets overlooked way too much. But there was also clerical fascism. In Romania, in Croatia, Hungary, Lithuania, Slovakia, and the Ukraine, there were clerical fascist movements that mobilized to kill the other, which in this case was overwhelmingly Jews. So much dreck to go through. All right, so there's a guy named Fritchie, University of Indiana, decided he was going to figure out who really voted for Hitler, which was a tough question before computers, because you could guess, but you couldn't do data entry. I love data entry. Facts are real in data entry if you don't, mind operator input error, but we won't go there. So Fritchie took this information from the German electoral records, which were quite good, and they also had, for each electoral district, they had an economic kind of understanding of who were there, what was the social and economic class of the people who were in each voting district. And what he discovered, contrary to either Dimitrov, who said it's the most vicious attack of the capitalist elites, or the people who said it was the working class, it was the laborers, it was the Untermensch, as the people who don't count who voted for Hitler. It turns out it was well-to-do middle-class people, the burger class, the shopkeepers, the small owners. It was actually a middle-class movement. Why were they angry? Well, they felt the government wasn't meeting their needs, and they had been displaced somehow, and they saw themselves being pushed down the social and economic ladder. Now, the fact was, they were right. They were being pushed down the social and economic ladder, but not to the extent that they feared, and certainly not to the extent of the people below them on the social economic ladder. So fascism is a movement of middle-class people who are or fear being pushed down the social and economic ladder, and they don't like the secret elites up above who are screwing them, but they can't reach them. Who can they reach? The people down below them, whoever they determine that to be, who are plotting against them. So this dynamic is you blame the secret elites up above, who really aren't so secret, and they are elites, but their conspiracy isn't how they're running things, and you reach down and attack the people below you because you can reach them, and you're not going to suffer any consequences because they're now identified as those evil people who are working with Satan or whoever. Umberto Eco has a great essay on the rhetoric of fascism and how just illusory it is. Lawrence Langer talks about the widespread absence of remorse among the accused in post-war trials of German leaders during the Nazi genocide, and that they basically, one of the things that's very troubling for people to understand is that a lot of the people who took part in this genocide had no regrets. They just didn't. They thought it was still the right thing to have done, and were pretty angry that they'd lost. So prejudice, bigotry, discrimination, dualism. I said I wouldn't read it, I'm lying. So obviously, these interrelate in very complex ways. But when you have all of them lining up, it's a pretty good idea that there is going to be the scripted violence. It tends to be the outcome of any society that has adopted a bunch of these things as now legitimate in polite society or in public speeches or in generally accepted conversations. I mean, you always have people at the cocktail parties talking about it's the Muslims, it's the Jews, it's the homosexuals. But, they know better than to go out in public and say this at some times because, to say that, black people and Mexicans are disgusting, they have dirty skin. You used to hear this in cocktail parties where I grew up because, my family was very conservative. We used to celebrate the installation of the Shah of Iran. Woo-hoo, go America. By the way, the government that was replaced by the Shah had been democratically elected, but so where do we go then? I guess I worry that with the way the media has sort of walked away from its role as defending the rights of people and afflict, with the line about nurturing the afflicted and afflicting the powerful. You know? Basically, the whole idea that grew really after World War II, that the role of the press and then the media, the electronic media, was to be the force, the fourth estate in society that would hold powerful people accountable for what they were doing. I mean, just a few decades before, the press, the media, you know, arranged for a war in Cuba. You know, did the Maine get blown? The ship, the Maine, get blown up by the Spanish? Well, who cares? You know, we'll just say it happened, and we'll get people to write up, you know, San Juan Hill and all that stuff. So the media actually was pretty much, according to George Seldes, another guy who I actually knew, one of the most famous muckrakers of the 20th century. The media was pretty corrupt. And it sort of went through several stages of taking itself more seriously, which sort of peaked with Watergate and the idea that the press had more ethics and more responsibility to tell the truth to power than the government did. It would be nice if government was honest. It would be nice if the information that we were basing our democratic society, small d, democratic society, decisions on was accurate. And since then, because of a whole lot of things, the rise of the internet and the ability to have multiple sources of news with their own individual political vantage point. Now, I have to tell you, I used to be on MSNBC a lot, and I stopped going on because I got really tired of them treating people who were right-wing and conservative as stupid and crazy, or saying stupid things about them. And I just said, you know, I'm just going to retreat back into studying, you know, really obscure things like, you know, what was the Iron Garden in Romania all about? That was a fascist, Orthodox, Christian? Anyway, so I don't like MSNBC, and I don't like Fox News because they don't give you enough factual information. They give you opinion. Now, I may happen to agree with a lot of the opinion on MSNBC, but it doesn't make it a democratic civil society, small d, when everyone is basing their decisions on their own biased information sources. I think one of the things we need to accept as a nation, and this is hard for me as someone who grew up a relatively privileged white guy. We're a nation built on the genocide of the indigenous peoples, on the bones of black slaves abducted from their homes, on the sweat of Chinese laborers and the labor and tears of Mexicans and Chicanos to this day. The so-called white settlers from England and Germany, the Nordic lands, became outnumbered soon by new immigrant groups. And so this idea of white nationalism, which came out of a kind of Nordicist, English, German idea of God's chosen people who also shared the ability to blush, show blood in the face, as the Nazis like to say. So, you know, the only real Christians are people who show blush, white people who show blood in their face. That's a mistranslation, incidentally, of the Bible, but they never really care about that. So what do you do? What do you do when you're being outnumbered by these new people? Well, suddenly the Irish become white. You know, the Irish weren't white for decades in the US, and they were the butt of many jokes and slurs. Who knows what a paddy wagon is? Come on, anybody knows what a, say it.
Where they hauled the Irish drunks away at the end of the weekend.
Yeah, that's where you put Paddy, the drunk Irishman, at the end of the weekend. You threw him into the paddy wagon and you took him to dry him out. Right. Well, that's a nice concept. So the Irish weren't white then. And there's a guy named Ignatieff who wrote a great book called How the Irish Became White. Well, then Italians and Russians. During the Palmer raids, we deported them by the thousands. Now, there's a great book by the guy, Louis Post, who actually signed the deportation orders after the fact. He wrote a book saying, you know, they never did any of the things we accused them of. It was just a panic. You know, there were a couple of anarchist bombs and some people were hurt, and so we deported thousands of Russians and Italians. Well, why? Well, they were both not white and red, or black if you were an anarchist. So they had the wrong political view, and they had the wrong Well, skin color? I mean, it gets a little murky here, but Russians and Italians weren't white yet, and then they became white. Pop! It's like magic. I love it. You know, biologists think race is a pretty silly idea, just in case you haven't heard the news yet. I got the memo a while ago. I hope you do too. And then the Poles, the Slavs, the people from Baltics and the Balkans. So what's the problem? Us white folks are running out of white folks. By 2050, we will be outnumbered. Now, who's white? Well, I guess folks have decided we can't convert more people into being white. And so there are all these white people who are worried that not only have they been pushed aside by these people they don't particularly like to live next to, but there's basically our nation is a white nation and it needs to be defended. Now, there are people in public life who have said that all along. Pat Buchanan, for instance, talked about, you know, if it's a white America, and if it's not white, it's not America. David Duke said the same thing. There was this guy in public office who said, well, the problem with David Duke is he used to wear, you know, Klan robes and a Nazi uniform, but he's basically right. That was a scary moment for the Republicans, but they basically pushed him aside. It's too honest. So where do we go then to defend democracy? What unites us then as a nation in an increasingly diverse society? Oh, that's one of my scary ones, don't worry. So I'm going to argue that prejudice plus power equals oppression, and that the key to that is making sure that people in power are not allowed to spread prejudice. You reverse the formula. So what unites us? I'm going to argue it's the 4 freedoms. Some of you know who said that, but don't spill the beans. My father was a lieutenant colonel in the Army Reserves. He was the highest ranking person in Hillsdale, New Jersey, and he was the Grand Marshal of the Memorial Day Parade. And I'll end with this. He fought in World War II, had a lot of prejudices about blacks and Jews, but when he came back, he said, I fought alongside them, so that's it. I'm not going to be, well, he probably was prejudiced against them, but he wasn't going to let that determine his actions, which is, I think, good enough for a lot of people. He would not talk about the war. He let an anti-war group march in the Memorial Day Parade because when the veterans groups went nuts, he basically let them scream for a while, then he said, this is our contract for who can march. They meet the contract. What the hell do you think we fought World War II for? So when I asked him the last time he was getting dressed to go to be Grand Marshal, he was dying of cancer, and in 20 years he had never talked about the war. And I said, you know, what is it? There must be something about this experience that was transcendent. And he was pinning on his medals, and he took out this one, which is the service medal for World War II. And it says on the back, freedom from fear and want, freedom of speech and religion. I think that's what unites us as a nation, or it should be. And I hope this evening I've helped you understand that there is a way forward, and it's an honorable and ethical one, and we must follow that path. Thank you. Actually, Jonathan, I want you, because you're not going to be in this light, to stand up here and point to people raising their hands. Come on, you can do it. All right. So I'm going to let Jonathan pick. Oh, thank you. See, the AV person back there is golden. I mean, she's just on top of her game. Questions?
Yes.
Yeah, please stand up and shout.
Hi. My name is James, and I am interested in the idea that, you know, I've kind of studied a lot into IMRAN and has talks about objectivism, and altruism, which is a very powerful, sense of needing to help people, and that has actually been kind of an example of taking this heroic fascist action. A lot of times they think that they're fighting for a majority or for a purpose. So when you see this idea of altruism kind of turned on its head, how do you think we can kind of deflect that, or talk about it, or what is the direction?
Well, I think, like I said, my wife and I spent 10 years in a white working class neighborhood where there were racial attacks. And the first couple of years, we were complete jackasses. Smash racism. That's a powerful argument. You're talking to people who are about, in their mind, to lose their homes, which is their retirement, and you tell them to smash racism? Well, that's, So we began to develop, with the help of actually some black ministers who basically said, you have to make the people who you're trying to counter see that it is in their self-interest to do something else. I think the lesson was hard because we were the heroic white people coming into the working class community and smashing racism. And one day a group of black ministers invited us over for a little discussion, and of course it was middle class black preachers. So we had coffee and cake and all the stuff of politeness. And we talked about our work, and they talked about, living in the neighborhood they lived in, because they couldn't live in our neighborhood because they'd be, hurt. There was a firebombing 2 blocks north of our house of a black family's home. There were firebombings. How many people saw the Blues Brothers movie? Remember the scene when the Nazi is forced off the bridge? That's an homage to the fact that there were Nazis down in Marquette Park, a big park. No black kid was allowed to spend more than an hour in Marquette Park until 1982. That was the park area where Martin Luther King marched in for an open housing march and had something like a stone or a bottle bounced off his head. Police didn't prosecute racial crimes. So when the minister said to us, you have to deal with the problem of black parents taking turns sleeping, we had no idea what they were talking about. And they said, well, you don't know that. Yeah, well, black parents in your neighborhood take turns sleeping so that one of them can be awake when the firebomb hits and they can get the kids out. And suddenly our strategy of smashing racism seemed pretty privileged. So we decided to work on the idea that no family should be at risk in our neighborhood. No family, not just black families. No kids should be at that kind of risk. And that appealed to the largely Catholic neighborhood. There were people who said, ethically, that's right, actually. And there was one day that this Catholic priest decided he's an assistant. He thought he was soon to be fired. He said, what would it be like, to his parish if the Sermon on the Mount was delivered here in Marquette Park? And he said, there'd be some talk about the attacks on our neighbors and the firebombings and our responsibility to deal with that in some constructive and powerful way. And he thought he'd be run out, but people came forward who had been silent. And this is the key to understanding. Most white people in that neighborhood were horrified at what was happening, but they didn't feel any ability to speak out against it. And when one person stood up from the pulpit and said, this is wrong, other people stood up. A group of students at a local Catholic high school made pins that said, rise above it. What does that mean? Well, people ask, what does that mean? And they say, rise above the violence and stop it. And they would then have a conversation. So you reach these people because they're people, because they share many of the same aspirations that you do, and you talk to them about how you can achieve those aspirations together, and how much easier that would be, and how much better we would all feel. And so I think that's the clue to good organizing. I once worked with a person who said, if you don't respect the person you're organizing, you're never going to organize them. So I think the first step is respecting them enough to have a conversation about what you share in that neighborhood. We started on our block with repairing the sidewalk, kids' safety, bicycles, and there was always a person who'd come to our block meeting and say, it's the black people, they're destroying our neighborhood. And we'd let them talk, and then we'd say, Okay, well, I guess we have a different way of looking at it, and we go back to our agenda. And, you know, they feel, after a while, they stopped saying those things. I don't think they changed their mind as much as they realized that the rest of the neighbors thought they were kind of stooges. And, you know, in a tight-knit community, it matters what other people think of you. So if you model behavior and you work with people who are beginning to see that change is possible, then other people come on board. And that's pretty much sociology 101. I mean, that's how you build a movement. I'm glad you asked that. At this website, probably Monday. What I'm going to do is keep track of all the questions. I'm going to put all the answers that I don't have at my fingertips. There's two studies, actually. One is a study about Rwanda, Serbia, but primarily about Rwanda by some people whose name I'm not going to be able to get back very quickly. The other one is, all of this is online now at academia.edu as basically heroes know which villains to kill. And I got permission from my publisher, who's usually not interested in making these things public, and they let me put it on, online at academia.edu, and anybody can see it. The other people, God, I always hate stiffing other scholars. But it's Frohart and a bunch of other people who did this study on Rwanda and use of civilization. And then there's a whole interesting media thing about constitutive rhetoric, which actually looks at the Francophile movement in Quebec and how you build a constituency using rhetoric. So I will get those up soon, maybe even tonight, or maybe not. But by Monday, for sure, I'll be back in Boston on Sunday. So
the essay that you mentioned on the rhetoric of fascism and the book on post-factual society, will those be on there as well?
Slow down and repeat that.
Okay. You mentioned an essay on the rhetoric of fascism and a book on the post-factual society. Will those be online as well?
Oh, yeah, I can put that up, sure.
Thank you so much. And then the question...
Oh, the third question, you cheat.
About media. I know that you made a really good case for looking at facts instead of just at claims, but also you made the point that social movements are organized around a claim. And so my question is, do you think there's a role for media to advocate for social movements and take more of a claim instead of just a fact-based position? And if so, how should that be approached by media?
I think media in a society has an ethical obligation to raise ethical and principles, raise ethical questions about whether or not the society is moving toward its stated goals. I mean, look at our stated goals and look what we've done. It's embarrassing. So I think media has an obligation to hold a mirror to society and saying, this isn't working. I mean, go back to look at Harvest of Shame about migrant workers, one of the first major television documentary about the abuse of migrant workers and the powerful effect it had, which then, of course, eroded. So you've got to keep doing it, and people backslide. So, media has an obligation to speak truth to power.
Version of fascism there, and their scapegoat is the police, and if so, how come if fascism targets people with ethnicity or race and not a body that's the police that is, like, it has every ethnicity and every race and every sexual orientation and everything?
Well, the issue is that when I talk about fascism, I'm talking about a laundry list of things, not just scapegoating. See, that's my big list. You'll find that on that website. Aren't you lucky? So, in other words, unless you have a lot of these factors, it's not fascism. I mean, the Griffin definition I read because I think it's really good. You know, it's a cathartic rebirth, heroic, you know, blah, blah, blah. Along with the rhetoric of the other. You know, I helped start a I'm not an attorney, but I worked as a paralegal. I helped start a newsletter on suing police for misconduct. And what you find out is that most police are not engaged in misconduct, but a few are. Where do you find the police who are engaged in misconduct? They tend to cluster in police departments where there is a failure to properly train and supervise. Those are phrases that come right out of the federal law that we use to sue the cities for failing to properly train and supervise. A properly trained police officer would not have pulled the trigger on 80% of the police shootings that are being protested by Black Lives Matter. You can actually talk to police officers who will say that, not publicly, but the fact is these are badly trained, badly supervised police officers. It's a rough job. I believe in retirement with pay when they fall apart. The worst thing a police department can do could keep somebody who's stressed out as a police officer on the job. It's a tough job. You know, get them help and pay them. But we don't do that. We keep police officers who are unfit for duty, the tiny percent, and if you look at the statistics, it's a tiny percent. And what's happening now is this white nationalist idea that black people are out of control and they're taking over, and the police officers, even the black officers, become imbued with this idea that the black, quote unquote, underclass is out to shoot them, and it becomes a kind of dynamic where they shoot first because they don't want to be hurt. So their mythology is that people in the black community are they're all fully armed and out to shoot police officers. Well, it's not true. The facts are much more complicated. The situations are much more complicated. And in police departments where you have a mayor and a police chief, you need both, who take people off the job who are not properly trained and supervised and train them and make sure their supervision is careful, you don't tend to have these incidents. So it's not fascism. It's basic bad management and people stressed out acting inappropriately.
You mentioned there are 4 freedoms.
Yes.
Speech, religion, want, and fear. That's what we are striving for.
Yes.
To build a cohesive society.
Yes, that's President Roosevelt,
Yeah.
not me.
Yeah, whoever. We are kind of received to agree.
Yes.
But if you carefully look at these are the reasons for all the arguments and frustrations among people. How can you use these to strengthen the love among people who fight for these things all the time? Look at the world now. They are fighting for these things. We are fighting for this also. How do we unite under those things? That's the key issue.
Well, you're right. I mean, it's like, how do you build that? Well, you know, the point is it doesn't just happen. It's not like just, oh, gee, let's do it. It takes hard work. It takes reorienting a media environment where putting anything that anybody says, no matter how false it is, on the air and saying, so-and-so says there was a Holocaust. Rebutting that is this crackpot anti-Semite. You know, so you have, you know, this imam says that, you know, less than 2% of the Muslims in the world want violence. Countering that is this hack from some right-wing group saying, they're armed to the teeth, they're out to get us, we got to get them first. And so that's not information in a democracy. So part of it is forcing somehow the media to stop selling underarm deodorant by threat. I mean, because remember, their market is selling ads. We are the product sold to the advertisers. That model is not functional because the more bizarre claims you make, the more histrionic claims you make, the more you sell your product, which is whatever the advertisers. The advertisers have to have pressure to stop funding, and in some cases they have. You know, Glenn Beck got pulled off the air because finally there was pressure on the advertisers saying, this guy is spreading the most cockamamie conspiracy theories spread by the John Birch Society for 20 years. You got to get him off the air. He's kind of, you know, just running amok. So you're right. It's not easy, but it, you know, there has been time and time again when examples of altruism came forward. I mean, the classic examples are, you know, the Danish, when they were going to round up all the Jews, they all put on yellow stars and said, figure them out. There was this tiny little Catholic community somewhere in a valley in France. And the Germans were going to come and round up all the Jews. And so all of the leaders of the town got together in town hall and said, well, we can't let that happen. Well, how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to take all these kids. They're all going to go to the Christian school. And, we'll, you know, they can do whatever they want, but they're all going to be with us in that school. And then we're going to take these people and hide them over here. And then this guy is going to be your son, and that woman is going to be your daughter. And the Germans came, and they were all saying, oh, there's no Jews here. Now, you know, you ask these people who could have been executed for doing this, why did they do it? And they all looked at each other and said, well, because that's what people do. So every major religion is built on the premise that people can do good things if they decide to. And, you know, whether you believe in predestination or free will, even if you're condemned to hell from birth in the Calvinist arch tradition, you can still do good things. Just, you know, it's going to not work out well for you if you believe in predestination, but don't worry about that. So you can make people work against their own self-interest for a greater self-interest built around the community. That's how communities are built, and that would be my answer. It's hard work, and we have to stop allowing corporations to buy airtime on TV to lie to us. We have to change the way the elections are funded. We have to do a lot of things and we have to give people a living wage. There are all these things we can do that'll make things better. So I'm optimistic in the face of my own research. Of course.
In historical contexts, before you have outbreaks of fascism or genocide, is there any research to suggest that there has been a breakdown of civil society to predate this, or are they unrelated phenomena?
Well, there is, in fact, a field called genocide studies that makes the argument that genocides are entirely predictable, and I think the most publicly useful resource for this is the group Facing History and Ourselves, which talks about a number of genocides and how genocides are not unknowable, as much as I respected some of the people who have said that. Genocides are entirely predictable, and they follow a pattern, and they always have. Mass ones really only occurred after the rise of the telegraph, so you could mechanize it. But the answer is civil society exists as a contract that has no paper. Everyone in the society has to agree, or not everyone, because you always are going to have outliers. Most of the people in the society have to agree that there are certain standards that we all are going to live by, and then we're going to show, you know, some anger at the people who step outside that and try and bring them back in to the center again. But see, the political center isn't the answer. The center of the ethical belief is what matters, because in Nazi Germany, the center thought killing Jews was great, or at least they shut their eyes and their mouths. So, you know, it's a tough issue of the ebb and flow of the ability of civil society to actually function. And there's sometimes it functions well, and it tends to function less well with diverse populations, and we need to work on that. And then there are times it collapses entirely. So.
But I'm suggesting that maybe we should be putting an emphasis on the need for civil society. We can't just expect the media to reform or the advocacy.
Louder, please.
So I'm suggesting that maybe we need to be putting an emphasis on the concept and the need for civil society. We can't just expect the media to reform, the advertisers to, you know, get morality or whatever. I mean, that's not going to happen first. I think we have
Yeah.
and model that and call people out when they don't do it.
Sure, but that becomes a matter of public acceptance of calling people out. And the dilemma then of allowing, and this happens on both the left and right, of billionaires allowing to saturate our airwaves with lies. You know, I am as appalled by some of the Democratic Party advertising as I am by the Republican Party advertising. I'm an equal opportunity, you know, nasty person. I just find this stuff annoying. But, you know, if I didn't think democracy could work, I wouldn't be wandering around doing this research. And democracy, I think, is civil society. Civil society is built around the ideas of human rights and democracy. And the UN will argue that that's, in fact, how it works, you know, with their human rights agenda and all of the subcategories. There's a lot of questions. There's a couple people who had their hand up for a while. There's a guy in a blue shirt over there, and there's a guy over there, and then we'll get, so you want to pick one? Anyone?
I think you can go.
There seems to be a lot of movement towards non-people claiming these four freedoms as their own rights, such as businesses. And, you know, examples even in our own politics would be that corporations have rights of humans now in some circumstances. Certain businesses believe that their religious rights kind of overturn or overwhelm others because they don't want to have people have abortions, for instance. How does that benefit society? How does that benefit our country?
Well, it hasn't, obviously. I mean, I'm going to agree with you. The idea, corporations were incorporated, made bodies for commerce. I don't think anyone who came up with that, I don't like the legislation that made that happen, but I don't think anyone ever took seriously the idea that meant they became people with the same rights as people. This is an aberrant legal theory that was spread by the Federalist Society, which was funded by these right-wing money bags who wanted to change the way that businesses were able to affect politics. It's not democracy, it's baloney. It's just ridiculous. No democracy can exist when commerce runs the political debate. And so, you know, obviously we need to reverse that law and make them be responsible for their debts and not allow them to spend their money, which we pay them for their products and services, to propagandize us about how they should get more money. It's just, that is part of the Democrats and Republicans both allowing the concentration of wealth at the top because they like their caviar and their 3 yachts. I don't know. To me, it's kind of a scheming, graspy, ridiculous obsession with money. How many yachts is enough? I know Aaron's here someplace saying, you should shut up now. I'm going to, wait. Aaron?
How about 3 more questions?
3 more.
I'm going to let you do that. Think diversity, think people who haven't asked questions, think students, think...
Okay.
Oh, wait, she already asked the question.
No, I didn't.
No, you didn't? No, you didn't. She did. All right, never mind. You did. Oh, you were in class.
I met you earlier today.
Yeah, that's right.
So you keep talking about democracy and how democracy is very important for us to have these freedoms and that it is the way that we are going to make our country better. But there is a lot of questioning. I hear a lot of people wondering if our country is still, and if it ever was really founded on democracy, because we have this electoral college that works in a funky way that I honestly don't understand. We have this 2-party system that really limits our choices in, say, presidential elections. There are people who want third parties to be available to vote on in the elections, and most states feel as though like their votes aren't going to count because the state is a majority one party or another. So my question basically is, do you think that we truly have democracy now? And if you don't, how do you think that we can get it?
No, raise hell.
Okay.
I mean, come on, from the very beginning, black people were 3/5 of a person. There's never been democracy. When did women get the right to vote? How many other countries beat us to allowing women to have the right to vote? I mean, it's nuts. We have never had a fully functioning democracy. For some people, they have never experienced democracy. And when people in some low-income and hungry communities think about fascism, they think about their neighborhood. They think they're living under, objectively, the outcome of fascism. What they're living under is a repressive surveillance state that has impoverished them based on public economic policy for the benefit of a handful of people who are billionaires. That's not a democracy. So I'd like there to be a democracy. I'm an optimist. I go around saying we should have this, but I don't think we have it. And we have never had it. And it would be nice if we tried to make it happen.
Do you think that
I'll sit around here later and talk, but
I wanted to ask you about the relationship between coded rhetoric and scripted violence, specifically in relation to Donald Trump's recent deployment of the law and order rhetoric. And I wanted to ask you what you think happened to that rhetoric, which was initially deployed by segregation activists. And I wanted to ask you what happens after Trump either is defeated or becomes president. So what happens to the movement of Trump advocates? Do his constituents just go away, or does the Republican Party activate even more of that coded rhetoric as it already has? Or is
I got the drift. First, there are ethical Republicans who have walked away from Trump at great political and personal pain. And I value what they have done. Second, Trump may be elected. We're probably one major terrorist act away from Trump being elected. I'm not giving anybody any ideas. They already know that. And he may not be elected. But whether or not he's elected, and I think things could be pretty ugly if he was elected. That's my personal political sentiment, but I'm not here to grind that axe. I think it's already happening, although the statistical evidence has to wait a few more months to see. But already there's an increase in attack on Muslims. I work with a wide range of different organized groups, on race, class, and gender. We are all, and over 100 of us are sharing emails and debating, how bad are things going to get no matter what happens, because we are already seeing the vilification and the scripted violence is inevitable. The only question is how bad will it be? So the noose has already been set. We just don't know who will get hanged. So it's a bad situation. And I can't predict what will happen. Except for this one thing, that some people will be hurt. Because that's the history of this. This is why I've been studying this for 30 years. There has to be some explanation for how this works. And there's probably 200 or 300 scholars who've devoted their lives to figuring this out. And there's pretty much a emerging consensus about it. So the answer is when this has already gone too far, and it's going to leave a lasting effect on the people who are having targets painted on their backs. Yeah.
Has her hand been up for a while?
Yeah, she's been jumping up and down.
I have a question regarding the discussion about media. With media being in a vacuum, and the vacuum being operated as capitalist money, the commercials, how do you handle the social media aspect of informing people? I teach American politics, and a lot of my students get their news from Facebook or Twitter. And while I think there's some validity to some of those outlets, that in another way is a vacuum. Because if they're seeing posts by some other minded people, are they being exposed to an alternate theory or an alternate perspective? And how can we counteract that?
No, I get it.
Yeah.
I I was in the underground press. I was on the board of the Underground Press Syndicate. I love alternative media. I love the new media. There's, you know, we are in the phase of this new electronic media, just like early radio listeners were, who panicked when the, you know, people from outer space invaded New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Anyway, so there will be a moment when we sort out all of these issues of what's reliable and what isn't. Gatekeeping was an aspect of editors. Editors had their own problems too, because they tended to represent the class which they came from. Now there are no gatekeepers, except you're seeing more and more people gravitating to sources of information that are mediated in some way, maybe moderated in some way, but in which the people who supply the information are sort of screened for their, you know, the Martians are coming aspect. You know, obviously, you can see some pretty weird posts on the Daily Kos, for instance. But a lot of the people who really get the most hits are people who are actually, like me, we used to be paid journalists. You know, now people give it away. So Daily Kos actually has a pretty good base of skilled journalists already working on it. You have people like David Nywert, who is an excellent, excellent poster. There's a lot of really good sources of information about certain aspects. I have a friend who's like a space scientist. Her website is a fabulous source of information about the rocket launches and stars and super nebula or whatever the hell those things are. She's fascinated by it, but she's actually skilled at it. So basically, this is a maturing media environment, and we haven't done so well yet. But then there are people, you know, trying to get away from the Martians in New Jersey. So there's time. I mean, there's still time. But it's a problem. And I don't think print newspapers will survive it. Just a fact. And so something will emerge in which people can base their sources of information with some degree of reliability. And that's my hope. But then I'm a guy who hopes that someday we'll actually have democracy. Thank you.